Listen to this amazing story of miraculous healing. Enjoy listening. The rhythmic rasp of the angle grinder against cold steel was Ethan's symphony. Dust motes, illuminated by the harsh glare of the welding arc, danced in the cavernous space of his converted warehouse loft. This was his sanctuary, a meticulously ordered cosmos of reclaimed industrial metals, power tools, and the abstract forms that were his lifeblood. At 31, Ethan had cultivated a rigid discipline, his days a precise calibration of physical exertion and conceptual thought. He lived for the tactile pleasure of shaping unyielding material, transforming forgotten girders and discarded pipes into eloquent statements of tension and balance. His forthcoming solo exhibition, Echoes of Industry, was not merely a collection of sculptures. It was the distilled essence of years spent in solitary communion with his art, a testament to his singular vision. He ran a calloused hand over the cool, corrugated surface of a new piece, a towering spire of interlocking gears, salvaged from an old textile factory. The faintest scent of ozone lingered in the air, a familiar perfume. This was where he found his peace, his control. The world outside, with its chaotic demands and messy emotions, was a distant hum, easily muted by the focused roar of his machinery. Here, within these brick walls, he was sovereign, an alchemist turning rust into revelation. His art was his armor, his voice, his entire universe. The first whisper of discord began subtly, an insidious change in the symphony of his existence. It was a dark mark, no bigger than a thumbnail, on the sole of his left foot. He'd first noticed it weeks ago, dismissing it as a stubborn bruise from a dropped tool, a common hazard in his line of work. He was always bumping into things, always accumulating minor nicks and scrapes. He'd even laughed it off with Clara, his older sister, during one of her infrequent whirlwind visits. "Just another battle scar," he'd grunted, limping slightly as he maneuvered a hefty I-beam into place. But the bruise didn't fade. Instead, it deepened, its edges blurring into an asymmetrical sprawl. It began to feel raised, almost pebbled under his touch, and an insistent tenderness bloomed, making his long hours standing at the welding table increasingly unbearable. He found himself shifting his weight constantly, favoring his right foot, which in turn put a strain on his back. The precise, almost balletic movements required for his intricate welding became punctuated by winces of discomfort. Then came the cough. It started as a dry, persistent tickle in his throat, easily attributed to the dust and fumes inherent in his studio environment. He'd invested in top-of-the-line ventilation, but a sculptor's lungs were rarely pristine. He'd ignore it, suppress it, especially when Clara was around. But it grew more insistent, a hacking bark that would leave him breathless, clutching his ribs. He started waking up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, the taste of copper in his mouth. The headaches were the most disorienting. They weren't the sharp, localized pain of a tension headache, but a dull, pervasive throb that seemed to emanate from deep within his skull, clouding his thoughts, blurring the precise lines of his vision. Sometimes the world would swim, the edges of his meticulously organized studio momentarily losing their crisp definition. He'd shake his head, rub his temples, and push through, attributing it to fatigue from late nights spent perfecting a seam, or the strain of deciphering complex engineering schematics. He was always tired, after all. An artist's life was demanding. Clara, practical and observant as ever, was the first to genuinely notice. She arrived unannounced one Tuesday, armed with a Tupperware container of her infamous lentil soup and a laundry basket brimming with his freshly laundered work clothes. Her gaze, accustomed to dissecting human ailments in the chaotic ER, was immediately drawn to his subtle limp. "Ethan, what's going on with your foot?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the hum of his exhaust fan. She didn't wait for an answer, already kneeling, her no-nonsense hands gently lifting his worn work boot. He tried to pull away, a typical reflex to her intrusions, but she held firm. Her eyes, usually calm and assessing, widened almost imperceptibly as she saw the dark, irregular lesion on his sole. It was angry, raised, and frankly, alarming. "It's just a bruise, Clara. I dropped a wrench," he muttered, trying to sound nonchalant, but his voice was rough from the cough he'd just suppressed. She ignored him, her fingers probing gently. "This is not a bruise, Ethan, not by a long shot. And you've lost weight. You look gray." She stood up, her jaw set. "You're seeing a doctor. Today, no arguments." His usual stubborn self-reliance, his carefully constructed wall of independence, felt suddenly porous. The persistent ache in his foot, the rasping cough, the dull throb behind his eyes. They coalesced into a silent chorus of agreement with Clara's pronouncement. He found himself nodding, a rare concession, the first crack in his meticulously maintained facade of invulnerability. The referral was immediate. Clara pulling strings only an ER nurse with 2 decades of experience could. The dermatologist's office was sterile and brightly lit, a stark contrast to the gritty warmth of his studio. The doctor, a young woman with kind but firm eyes, examined his foot with a somber expression. She took biopsies, her movements precise and unnervingly quick. "We'll know more in a few days, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice carefully neutral, but her gaze lingered on him a moment too long. A few days later, the phone call came. It was the dermatologist, her voice now devoid of neutrality, laced with a professional urgency that sent a chill down his spine. "Mr. Vance, the biopsy results are back. We need you to see an oncologist immediately. I've already made an appointment for you this afternoon." He sat in the oncologist's office, the antiseptic smell clinging to his clothes, as Dr. Anya Sharma, a woman with weary eyes and a direct manner, laid out the facts. Her voice was calm, almost dispassionate, as she described something called acral lentiginous melanoma. He'd never heard the words before, but the gravity in her tone, the way she carefully enunciated each syllable, left no room for misunderstanding. "It's a rare and aggressive form of melanoma, Ethan," she explained, gesturing to a diagram on a screen. "It typically appears on the palms or soles, often mistaken for a bruise or fungal infection until it's advanced." She clicked to another slide, showing an ugly dark lesion. It looked terrifyingly familiar. "Unfortunately, yours is quite advanced. We found evidence of significant metastases." The word hung in the air, heavy and final. Metastases. It sounded like a death knell. "The scans show spread to your lungs, specifically multiple nodules, and a concerning lesion in your brain, Mr. Vance, in the frontal lobe." His mother, Ilara, who had insisted on accompanying him, let out a choked gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. She was a retired art history professor, prone to dramatic pronouncements and an almost theatrical sensitivity. Now her face crumpled, tears streaming down her carefully made-up cheeks. "My boy, my beautiful boy," she sobbed, burying her face in Clara's shoulder. Clara, ever the pragmatist, remained outwardly stoic, though her knuckles were white where she gripped her hands in her lap. Her gaze was fixed on Dr. Sharma, absorbing every word, already mentally cataloging, strategizing. "What's the prognosis, doctor? What are our options?" Dr. Sharma sighed, a faint line of weariness deepening between her brows. "The prognosis for stage 4 ALM, especially with lung and brain metastases, is challenging. It's an aggressive cancer. We'll start with immunotherapy and targeted therapy immediately. We're fighting against time." Ethan felt a cold, almost detached shock settle over him. His mind, usually so acute, so focused on the intricacies of his art, seemed to splinter. Stage 4, brain lesion, aggressive. The words echoed, but they didn't quite connect to him. To the man who lived for the roar of his welder, the satisfying weight of a finished sculpture. He saw his studio, his tools, his half-finished piece on the workbench, and a profound sense of injustice, of robbed potential, began to curdle in his gut. His primary concern wasn't his life, not immediately. It was his hands, his vision, his ability to create. The brain lesion. Would it affect his fine motor skills, his spatial awareness, the very essence of his artistry? The thought was a more profound terror than any fear of death. Artistic paralysis. That was the true horror. A deep-seated anger began to simmer beneath the surface of his shock, directed at his own body, at the universe, at the cruel randomness of it all. How could something so vital, so fundamental to his identity, be threatened by something as insidious and alien as this? His sculptures, once symbols of his control, now felt like mocking monuments to a future that might never be. He ran a calloused hand over the cool corrugated surface of a new piece, a towering spire of interlocking gears salvaged from an old textile mill. His focus was absolute, the world outside the law fading to a distant hum. But lately a different kind of hum had started, an unwelcome static in his perfectly tuned existence. It had begun subtly, a nagging ache in his left foot, specifically on the sole. He dismissed it initially, attributing it to a dropped wrench, or perhaps the sheer number of hours he spent on his feet, welding and grinding. Sculpting was a physical art, and minor injuries were occupational hazards. The mark itself was small at first, a dark spot no bigger than a lentil, easily mistaken for a bruise. But bruises faded. This spot, however, remained, and then it began to change. It wasn't just dark anymore. It was variegated, with shades of brown and black bleeding into each other like spilled ink. The edges, which had once been somewhat defined, now seemed to fuzz outwards, irregular and unsettling. It started to raise slightly, a faint, almost imperceptible mound under his skin, making his long hours of standing in the studio unbearable. Every step became a conscious effort, a dull throb radiating up his leg. He found himself shifting his weight, limping almost imperceptibly, a minor inconvenience that gnawed at the edges of his concentration. Concurrently, a dry, persistent cough had taken root in his chest. It wasn't severe enough to stop him from working, but it was a constant, irritating presence, especially in the quiet hours of the night. He'd tried over-the-counter remedies, convinced it was just a lingering cold or the unavoidable dust from his grinding. Then came the headaches, not debilitating migraines but a low, throbbing pressure behind his eyes, often accompanied by a faint shimmer at the periphery of his vision. He'd blame it on dehydration, or the glare of the welding torch, or simply the mental strain of conceptualizing complex forms. Ethan was a man who prided himself on his self-sufficiency, his ability to push through discomfort. He had always believed that the body was merely a vessel for the mind's creative force, and any physical ailment was a weakness to be ignored or overcome. His older sister Clara, however, was not so easily dismissed. A no-nonsense ER nurse with an uncanny ability to spot trouble before it declared itself, Clara had a practical, almost clinical eye for human frailty. She'd descended on his loft unannounced one Saturday, ostensibly to drop off some homemade sourdough. "Ethan, what's with the limp?" she'd asked, her eyes narrowing as he tried to subtly shift his weight. He'd mumbled something about a pulled muscle, but Clara was persistent. She watched him move, observed the slight favoring of his left side, and then, without asking, she'd knelt, unlaced his heavy work boot, and peeled off his sock. The sight of his foot, usually so unremarkable, now exposed the undeniable truth. The mark was no longer small. It was a mottled, angry-looking lesion, nearly an inch across, with an asymmetrical shape and an alarming darkness. Clara's expression, usually composed, faltered for a fraction of a second. "Ethan," she said, her voice dropping to a low, serious tone that brooked no argument, "that is not a bruise. Not even close. You're seeing a doctor. Tomorrow." He'd bristled, of course. "Clara, it's nothing. Probably just a stubborn wart." "A wart that looks like that? And you're coughing constantly and you've got those shadows under your eyes. Don't be an idiot, Ethan. This isn't a creative block you can sculpt your way out of. This is serious." Her medical intuition, honed by years in the emergency room, screamed at her. She saw the subtle signs he tried to hide, the underlying fatigue, the slight tremor in his hands when he reached for his coffee. Her insistence was unwavering, overriding his usual stubborn self-reliance. He acquiesced, grumbling, but knowing that when Clara used that tone, resistance was futile. The following days were a blur of sterile waiting rooms and probing questions. First, a dermatologist who took one look at his foot and immediately scheduled a biopsy. Then the call, delivered in a measured clinical voice that somehow amplified the gravity of each word. Malignant melanoma, aggressive. The speed with which things escalated was disorienting. From the dermatologist, he was ushered into the world of oncology. The oncologist, a Dr. Evans, was a kindly woman with tired eyes who spoke in precise, gentle terms. Ethan sat across from her, Clara on one side, his mother, Ilara, on the other. Dr. Evans projected scans onto a large screen, images of his own body, now alien and terrifying. "Ethan," she began, her voice soft but firm, "the biopsy confirmed acral lentiginous melanoma. Unfortunately, the PET scan shows significant metastasis. We found lesions in your lungs and a concerning spot on your brain. Stage 4. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Stage 4. It sounded like the final act of a play he hadn't chosen to star in. His mind, usually so sharp and analytical, felt numb, encased in a thick fog. He heard aggressive nature and grim prognosis, but the details blurred. His primary concern, the one that clawed at him with icy tendrils, was purely selfish. His hands, his vision, his ability to sculpt. How could he create if his body, his very instrument, was failing him? The thought of his studio, now a potential mausoleum for unfinished dreams, filled him with a cold dread far worse than any fear of death. Next to him, his mother Ilara, a retired art history professor, prone to dramatic pronouncements, let out a choked sob. Her face was streaked with tears, her elegant hands clenched into fists in her lap. "Oh, my beautiful boy," she wailed, her voice thick with despair. "Why? Why you?" Her grief was immediate, raw, and utterly theatrical, a stark contrast to Ethan's internal, almost detached shock. Clara, ever the pragmatist, was already pulling out her phone. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set. "What are the treatment options, doctor?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Experimental trials? Immunotherapy? What are the latest advancements? We need to know everything." She was already researching, already fighting, a whirlwind of practical action against the tide of despair. Ethan watched them, distantly aware of their separate reactions, feeling a profound sense of injustice. The world had just shattered, and all he could think of was the cold, unyielding metal that now seemed impossibly far from his grasp. The fuzziness around the edges of the mark on his soul was what finally nudged Ethan from his dismissive indifference to a low thrum of unease. It wasn't a bruise, it was something else, something growing. And then came the tenderness, a sharp, insistent pain with every step, every shift of weight, forcing him to favor his right foot, introducing an awkward hitch to his gait. The rhythmic clatter of his tools, once a comforting symphony, now seemed to jar his whole body. He found himself propping his foot up more often, the once unbearable thought of pausing his work becoming a creeping necessity. Then the cough started, a dry, persistent hack that seemed to lodge deep in his chest, rattling his ribs. He blamed the fine metal dust, the welding fumes, anything but the unsettling truth he was beginning to intuit. He'd always prided himself on his physical resilience, his body a silent, efficient engine for his art. This sudden betrayal felt personal, an unwelcome intrusion into his carefully constructed world. He started taking longer, hotter showers, hoping the steam would clear his lungs, but the cough only deepened, and the headaches. They arrived like uninvited guests, sudden, disorienting thumps behind his eyes that blurred his vision for a fleeting, terrifying moment. He'd always had perfect sight, crucial for the intricate details of his sculptures. The thought of losing that precision, that control, sent a cold spike of fear through him. He was in the middle of grinding down a particularly stubborn weld seam when the studio door burst open, shattering the quiet hum of his focus. "Ethan! What in God's name are you doing limping around like that?" It was Clara, his older sister, her voice cutting through the air like the screech of an unlubricated hinge. Clara, the ER nurse, whose life was a perpetual triage of emergencies, both medical and familial. She stood there, arms crossed, her practical, sensible shoes planted firmly on his dusty concrete floor, her gaze immediately locking onto his left foot. "It's nothing, Clara. Just a pulled muscle. Been on my feet too long." He tried to sound nonchalant, but the pain shot through him as he shifted his weight. She scoffed, a sound he knew well. "Pulled muscle? That's not a limp, Ethan. That's a hobble. And you look like you haven't slept in a week. What's with the cough?" She closed the distance between them with brisk efficiency, her eyes narrowing as she took in his pale face, the dark circles under his eyes. Before he could protest, she knelt, unlaced his boot, and gently but firmly peeled off his sock. The sight of his foot, exposed in the harsh studio light, confirmed his unspoken fears. The mark wasn't just variegated, it was raised, an angry, asymmetrical lesion that looked less like a bruise and more like a grotesque, dark flower unfurling on his soul. Clara gasped, a sharp intake of breath. "Ethan, what is this? How long has this been here?" Her voice, usually so steady, held a tremor of shock. "A while," he mumbled, suddenly feeling exposed, vulnerable. "Thought it was a bruise." She didn't respond directly. Instead, she pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. "I'm calling Dr. Ramirez. You're going in this afternoon. No arguments. This isn't a pulled muscle, Ethan. Not by a long shot." Her voice was tight with suppressed alarm, a tone he rarely heard from her. He knew then, with a chilling certainty, that this was more than just a minor inconvenience. This was serious. This was beyond his control, beyond his ability to sculpt away. The next few days were a blur of sterile waiting rooms, cold examination tables, and a procession of doctors. First, Dr. Ramirez, the dermatologist, whose calm, professional demeanor couldn't mask the grave concern in her eyes as she performed a biopsy. Then came the phone call, her voice carefully modulated, but the word melanoma hung in the air like a lead weight. Rapid referrals followed, to an oncologist, a pulmonologist, a neurologist. Each specialist brought with them a new layer of dread, a new piece of a terrifying puzzle. The day of the official diagnosis, the air in the oncologist's office felt thick and suffocating. Clara sat beside him, rigid with tension, while his mother, Ilara, perched on the edge of her seat, her usually expressive face drawn and pale. Dr. Chen, a man with kind eyes and a weary voice, spoke gently but directly, his words falling like hammer blows. "Mr. Vance, the biopsy results, combined with the scans, they confirm our fears. It's stage 4 acral lentiginous melanoma." He paused, letting the clinical term sink in. "It's aggressive. We found significant metastases in your lungs, and there's a lesion, unfortunately, in your brain." Ethan felt a cold, detached shock settle over him. Stage 4, aggressive, lungs, brain. The words echoed, but his mind immediately leaped to a different, more personal horror. His hands, his vision, his ability to sculpt. This wasn't just about his life, it was about his art, about the very essence of who he was. The thought of his tools lying dormant, his creative spark extinguished, was a physical ache, worse than any pain in his foot. Ilara's breath hitched, and then a low, keening sob escaped her. She crumpled in her chair, burying her face in her hands. "My son, my beautiful boy." Her dramatic pronouncements, usually so irritating, now felt like a desperate, guttural cry of despair. Clara, however, was already moving. Her face was set, grim. She pulled out a small notebook and a pen. "Okay, Dr. Chen, what's the treatment plan? What are the options? Immunotherapy? Targeted therapy? Are there clinical trials? What's the prognosis, really?" Her voice was clipped, efficient, already in full ER nurse mode, dissecting the crisis, searching for a solution. Ethan just sat there, numb. His gaze drifted to the window, to the mundane street scene outside. People walking, living, utterly oblivious to the shattered world within these four walls. A profound sense of injustice washed over him, followed by a deep, cold anger. Anger at his body's betrayal, at the universe's arbitrary cruelty. He was just on the cusp of his exhibition, years of solitary dedication about to culminate. And now this, the unsculptable truth, the ultimate disruption to his ordered, self-contained world. His art, his life's one true purpose, felt suddenly, terrifyingly out of reach. The sterile scent of the hospital, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of his studio, became Ethan's new normal. The first few weeks of immunotherapy and targeted therapy were a blur of infusions. The rhythmic drip of IV fluids, his new soundtrack. The initial optimism, a thin veneer Clara had tried to project, quickly eroded under the relentless assault of side effects. Fatigue descended like a suffocating blanket, pinning him to the hospital bed, then to his own sofa. Each movement felt like wading through treacle. Nausea, a constant churning knot in his stomach, made the thought of food repulsive, and the once robust frame that had effortlessly hoisted steel beams began to dwindle. His skin, usually resilient and unblemished, save for the occasional welding burn, erupted in an angry rash, a cruel parody of the vibrant colors he sculpted into his work. The worst, though, was the neuropathic pain that began to prickle and then burn in his hands, 1,000 tiny needles dancing under his skin. His hands, his instruments of creation, felt alien, unreliable. He would clench and unclench them, trying to banish the sensation, but it clung stubbornly, a constant reminder of his body's betrayal. His meticulously organized studio, once his sanctuary, now seemed like a mocking monument to his former self. He could barely muster the energy to walk the few steps to its threshold, let alone wield a grinder or a torch. His tools lay dormant, gathering a thin film of dust, each inert form a silent accusation. The half-finished spires of echoes of industry stood like skeletal remains, their metallic surfaces reflecting only his own hollowed-out image. Clara, a whirlwind of efficiency and concern, tried to manage his daily life. She'd bring him bland, tasteless meals, remind him to take his array of pills, and gently suggest walks, or even just a change of scenery. Each attempt to help felt like an invasion, a further erosion of his independence. "I can manage, Clara," he'd rasp, pushing away a plate of oatmeal, the words feeling like gravel in his throat. He saw the flicker of hurt in her eyes, but he couldn't stop himself. Dependency was weakness, a surrender he wasn't ready to make, even as his body made it for him. The thought of her bathing him or helping him dress filled him with a cold dread. He was a sculptor, a creator, not a helpless invalid. Ilara, on the other hand, approached his suffering with a different kind of intensity. "Ethan, my darling," she'd begin, her voice a theatrical whisper, "we must find beauty in this crucible. Art therapy. Think of it, a chance to express this profound struggle, to transmute pain into—" He'd cut her off, his voice sharper than he intended. "Mother, please. I don't need to transmute anything. I need to get back to work. This isn't some abstract concept for me to intellectualize." He saw her deflate, her shoulders slumping, and felt a pang of guilt, quickly swallowed by his own bitter resentment. Her suggestions felt patronizing, a flimsy attempt to impose her artistic framework onto his raw, physical suffering. What did she know of the unforgiving nature of metal, or the searing pain that now alienated him from his craft? The days blurred into weeks, punctuated by the relentless cycle of treatment and debilitating recovery. His world had shrunk to the confines of his small apartment, the hospital, and the agonizing internal landscape of his own failing body. The cancer was not just attacking his cells, it was dismantling his identity, chipping away at the very core of who he was. He was an artist, and without the ability to create, he felt himself becoming nothing more than a vessel for pain, a hollowed-out shell. The frustration simmered constantly, a low, burning heat beneath his skin, fueled by his physical pain and the gnawing certainty that his artistic wellspring was drying up, leaving behind only dust and despair. He was losing control not just of his body, but of the one thing that had defined him, his art. And in that loss, he felt a profound, terrifying emptiness begin to bloom. The sterile scent of the hospital, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of his studio, became Ethan's new normal. The first few weeks of immunotherapy and targeted therapy were a blur of infusions, the rhythmic drip of IV fluids his new soundtrack. The initial optimism, a thin veneer Clara had tried to project, quickly eroded under the relentless assault of side effects. Fatigue descended like a suffocating blanket, pinning him to the hospital bed, then to his own sofa. Each movement felt like wading through treacle. Nausea, a constant churning knot in his stomach, made the thought of food repulsive, and the once robust frame that had effortlessly hoisted steel beams began to dwindle. His skin, usually resilient and unblemished save for the occasional welding burn, erupted in an angry rash, a cruel parody of the vibrant colors he sculpted into his work. The worst, though, was the neuropathic pain that began to prickle and then burn in his hands. 1,000 tiny needles dancing under his skin, making even the lightest touch agonizing. His hands, his tools, the very extensions of his artistic will, were betraying him. He tried to grip a piece of scrap metal one afternoon, the familiar cool weight designed to ground him, but a jolt of searing pain shot up his arm, forcing him to drop it with a clatter. The sound echoed in the sudden silence of his once vibrant studio, a mocking reminder of his impotence. Clara, ever practical, had compiled a meticulous spreadsheet of his medications, appointments, and symptoms. She tried to coax him into short walks, to nibble on bland toast, to talk about anything other than the relentless ache in his bones. He met her efforts with a wall of silent resentment. Dependency felt like a physical burden, heavier than any sculpture he'd ever lifted. When she tried to help him adjust a pillow, her touch brushing his raw skin, he flinched away, almost imperceptibly. "I can do it," he'd mumbled, his voice hoarse, the words tasting like ash. He saw the flicker of hurt in her eyes, but he couldn't bring himself to care. He was a machine breaking down, and he certainly didn't need another mechanic. Elara, on the other hand, arrived armed with crystals, essential oils, and an endless stream of New Age platitudes. "Ethan, darling, have you tried visualizing your cells as tiny warriors, battling the darkness?" She'd cooed, holding up a shimmering amethyst. "Or perhaps some expressive art therapy to channel this energy into something beautiful?" She'd even brought him a small set of watercolors and a pristine pad of paper. He'd stared at the untouched materials with a cold, hollow rage. Watercolor? His medium was fire and steel, the relentless shaping of raw, unyielding matter. This soft, ephemeral nonsense felt like a patronizing insult, a childish distraction from the gaping maw of his reality. "No, Mother," he'd said, his voice flat. "I haven't, and I won't." He could sense her retreating, wounded, but he felt no remorse. They didn't understand. How could they? His suffering was his alone, and so was his art, or rather the absence of it. The studio, his sanctuary, became a tomb. The welding helmet lay gathering dust on his workbench. The arc welder's cables coiled like sleeping snakes. Each piece of unfinished work, each half-formed sculpture, seemed to mock him, a testament to a future that was rapidly shrinking. He would sit for hours on the worn leather sofa, staring at the darkened forms, feeling nothing but a profound emptiness. His hands, once so strong and precise, now trembled with a persistent, almost imperceptible tremor, a neurological side effect that had begun to creep in as the brain metastasis continued its insidious growth. The fine motor control, essential for the intricate detailing of his art, was slipping away. He tried to sketch a preliminary step in his process, but the lines wavered, defying his will. He crumpled the paper, the sound a dull echo of his own frustration. Then came the visual disturbances. First, it was just a slight blurriness in his peripheral vision, easily dismissed as fatigue. But soon the world began to warp. Straight lines would ripple, colors would desaturate, and sometimes a sudden flash of light would obliterate a section of his sight, leaving a momentary, terrifying void. He'd grip the arms of the sofa, waiting for the world to coalesce, the fear a cold knot in his stomach. How could he sculpt if he couldn't even see? How could he create if his own mind was turning against him? The news from his last scan was a hammer blow. "The brain lesion shows continued progression, Ethan," Dr. Ramirez had explained, his voice carefully modulated, "and we've identified a new, aggressive lesion on your right foot as well. We're adjusting your treatment protocol, but..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. The implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The treatment wasn't working. He was losing. That night, a storm raged outside, mirroring the maelstrom within him. The wind howled through the gaps in the warehouse walls, a mournful lament. Ethan stared at the half-finished sculpture on his stand, a complex, interlocking piece meant to symbolize the unbreakable spirit of industry, a testament to endurance. It was a lie. He felt nothing but breakage. He stumbled to his feet, The pain in his hands and feet a dull throb, the visual distortions making the room swim. He approached the sculpture, his eyes fixed on its metallic curves, once so full of promise. Now it was just a heavy, meaningless shell. A guttural cry tore from his throat, a primal sound of despair and rage. He seized a heavy angle grinder, its cold weight familiar in his trembling hands, and brought it down, not with the precise, controlled arcs of creation, but with a wild, destructive fury. Sparks flew, not from careful shaping, but from violent impact. Metal shrieked as he smashed the grinder against the sculpture's polished surface, denting, gouging, shattering the intricate welds. He swung again and again, a madman possessed, until the once proud form lay in twisted, broken pieces on the concrete floor, a mangled corpse of his own despair. He collapsed beside it, bone-deep exhaustion warring with a raw, visceral anguish, the metallic tang of pulverized steel mixed with the coppery taste of his own defeat. His art, his purpose, his very being. It was all a lie. He was a broken vessel, his creative spirit consumed by the malignant force within him. There was no meaning in this suffering, no deeper purpose, just decay. And in that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of his own making, Ethan felt utterly, hopelessly alone in the vast, echoing silence of his shattered crucible. 1,000 tiny needles dancing under his skin, making the simplest touch agony. His grip, once iron strong, now wavered, and the thought of holding a grinder, even a small one, was an impossible dream. His studio, once his sanctuary, became a vast, echoing tomb of dormant tools and unfinished ideas. He would stand at the threshold, the scent of metal and oil a torment, his heart aching with an emptiness he couldn't fill. Clara, in her pragmatic way, tried to manage his care, bringing him bland broths and reminding him to take his pills. She suggested occupational therapy, gentle exercises for his hands, but he merely shook his head, a dark cloud of resentment settling over him. He saw her attempts as a constant reminder of his helplessness, a weakness he couldn't bear to acknowledge. Ilara, true to form, floated in with crystals and essential oils, murmuring about drawing out the toxins and channeling positive energy through guided meditations. When she suggested art therapy, finger painting perhaps, or watercolors, a laugh, hollow and humorless, escaped him. Art therapy, he'd rasped, his voice raw from the cough that gnawed at his lungs. My art is about forging steel, mother, not about dabbing paint. He turned his face to the wall, shrinking from their well-meaning intrusions, preferring the desolate comfort of his own silent suffering. The frustration mounted, a relentless pressure building beneath his skin. His body was betraying him, his family was encroaching, and his very essence, his ability to create, was being stripped away, leaving him raw and exposed. His condition, instead of improving, continued its agonizing decline. The brain lesion, a malignant shadow on his scans, began to manifest in terrifying ways. Intermittent visual disturbances flickered at the edges of his vision, a shimmering aura around lights, a sudden blurring of lines, as if the world itself was losing its sharp edges. More alarming were the tremors that began in his dominant right hand. Subtle at first, a slight wobble when he tried to lift a cup, then escalating into an uncontrollable jitter that made even signing his name an exercise in frustration. The fine motor skills, once so precise, so crucial to his craft, were eroding. The thought of guiding a welding torch, of meticulously grinding a curve, became a cruel joke. Then came the new tumor, a fresh horror blooming on the sole of his other foot, mirroring the first. It was faster, more aggressive, spreading with a terrifying speed that mocked the slow, torturous progress of his treatment. Despair became a constant companion, a heavy cloak that smothered all light. He would lie awake at night, the cough tearing at his chest, the tremors making his hand dance a macabre jig, and stare into the darkness, a profound sense of injustice curdling within him. What was the point? What was the meaning of all his painstaking effort, his singular devotion, if it could be so easily erased by a rogue cell? The art, once his anchor, His reason for being now felt like a hollow mockery. He couldn't create. He couldn't even conceptualize. His mind, once a bustling workshop of ideas, was now a barren wasteland, choked by fear and pain. One afternoon, during a particularly violent coughing fit, a wave of pure, unadulterated rage surged through him. He looked at the half-finished sculpture on its stand, a twisted, powerful form of reclaimed I-beams, a testament to his old strength. It seemed to mock him, a symbol of everything he was losing. With a guttural cry, more animal than human, he lurched forward, his trembling hands finding purchase on a loose beam, and with a surge of desperate, adrenaline-fueled strength, he pulled. The sculpture, designed to be immovable, swayed precariously, then crashed to the concrete floor with a deafening clang, sending shards of metal scattering like shrapnel. He stood panting amidst the wreckage, tears blurring his vision, feeling utterly disconnected from the creative spirit that had once defined him, consumed by a despair so profound it felt like a physical weight crushing him. His resilience, once a source of fierce pride, had shattered, leaving him adrift in a sea of hopelessness. It was during this nadir, a particularly bleak hospital stay following a terrifying episode of disorientation and weakness, that a new face appeared. Dr. Eris Thorne. He wasn't like the other doctors, with their sterile white coats and clipped medical jargon. Eris had an artist's air about him, a slightly rumpled linen shirt, hands stained with what looked suspiciously like charcoal, and an aura of quiet intensity. He introduced himself as an art therapist, and Ethan bristled immediately, expecting another saccharine offer of watercolors. But Eris didn't push. Instead, he pulled up a chair by Ethan's bed, his gaze direct and calm. "I understand you're a sculptor, Ethan," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Metal, I hear. Welding, grinding, the real work." Ethan grunted, a non-committal sound. "I used to sculpt, you know," Eris continued, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Before I found a different kind of chisel, but I never mastered welding. Always wanted to. Always admired the control, the precision it takes to fuse disparate elements into a unified whole." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I was thinking, perhaps you could teach me? Not about the grand concepts, not about the art of it, not yet. Just the mechanics, the pure physics, the heat, the angles, the science of it all. I have some books, some diagrams. I could bring them in, and you could point out where I'm going wrong." Ethan frowned, surprised. Teach? Not be taught? The idea was so unexpected, so contrary to the endless stream of advice and pity he'd been subjected to. It was a challenge, a subtle recognition of his knowledge, his expertise, even in his current debilitated state. A tiny, almost imperceptible flicker stirred within him. Not hope, not yet, but a faint spark of intellectual engagement. He found himself grudgingly agreeing. "Fine," he rasped, his voice still weak. "Bring your diagrams." Eris returned the next day, not with paint and brushes, but with technical manuals on metallurgy and welding techniques. His own sketchbook filled with curious, almost architectural drawings. Ethan, initially detached, found himself explaining the precise temperature needed for a clean bead weld, the correct angle to hold the torch, the subtle dance between filler rod and base metal. He couldn't feel the weight of the torch, couldn't see the shimmering pool of molten metal, but he could articulate the process, the intricate steps, the years of muscle memory replaying in his mind. Eris listened with genuine interest, scribbling notes, asking intelligent questions, and for the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a faint sense of purpose beyond simply existing. He was needed, if only as a repository of knowledge. A few days later, Eris introduced him to Leo. "Ethan, this is Leo," he said, gesturing to a small, frail boy with enormous, curious eyes perched in a wheelchair, a worn sketch pad clutched in his lap. Leo, all of 7 years old, suffered from a rare, aggressive bone disease that had already claimed part of his leg and was steadily progressing. His medical future was grim, but his imagination, judging by the fantastical creatures that spilled across his pages, dragons with butterfly wings, three-eyed squirrels and griffins covered in iridescent scales, was boundless. Eris explained that Leo loved to draw, But his fine motor skills were also deteriorating, making it hard for him to bring his vivid creations to life off the page. Leo looked up at Ethan, his eyes wide and shy, and gently offered his sketch pad. Ethan, despite himself, felt a strange pull, a faint echo of the wonder he used to find in raw materials, in the promise of creation. When she suggested art therapy, finger painting with watercolors for God's sake, Ethan had stared at her with such cold fury that even Alara had retreated, muttering apologies about misunderstanding his artistic essence. Dependency felt like a physical assault, a constant chipping away at the self-reliance that had defined him. He was a sculptor, a creator, not a patient to be coddled. His spirit, already frayed, had snapped. The brain lesion, a silent terror during his waking hours, now asserted its insidious presence. Intermittent visual disturbances, like static on an old television screen, flickered at the edges of his vision. Worse still were the tremors, subtle at first, then increasingly pronounced in his dominant right hand. Holding a pen became a struggle, let alone a welding torch. The thought of shaping metal, of coaxing beauty from raw material, was a cruel joke. Then, as if the universe delighted in torturing him, a new aggressive tumor bloomed on his other foot, mirroring the first, a grotesque twin. The studio, once a sacred space, now felt like a mausoleum. One afternoon, consumed by a fit of impotent rage, he had seized a half-finished abstract piece, a complex intertwining of brushed steel and salvaged copper, meant to symbolize resilience, and hurled it against the concrete floor. The screech of metal, the splintering of connections he had so painstakingly forged, echoed the shattering of his own spirit. He felt utterly disconnected from the creative force that had defined his life, consumed instead by an all-encompassing despair. It was during a particularly bleak hospital stay, the sterile white walls pressing in, that a new figure entered his periphery. Dr. Eris Thorne, not the usual crisp white coat, but a worn tweed jacket, a hint of charcoal smudged on one sleeve. Ethan had braced himself for another well-meaning but ultimately useless therapist, another attempt to express his feelings through macaroni art. But Eris didn't push. He sat on the edge of the bed, a quiet presence, and introduced himself not as a therapist, but as a former sculptor. "I'm here to learn, Ethan," he'd said, his voice calm, non-judgmental. "Not about your illness, but about your craft. I've seen some of your work in the gallery brochures Clara brought in. Incredible command of form. I've always struggled with the arc of a TIG weld." Ethan, initially resistant, found a flicker of something he hadn't felt in months. Curiosity. Eris didn't ask him to do anything, just to explain. He brought in diagrams, detailed schematics of metal alloys, and asked Ethan to elaborate on the nuanced properties of different types of steel, the precise temperatures required for a clean fusion, the subtle dance of filler rod and arc. It was purely intellectual, a mental exercise that bypassed his ravaged body. Ethan found himself explaining, in increasing detail, the intricacies of metallurgy, the almost alchemical process of transforming brute material into something ethereal. He couldn't wield the torch, but he could still articulate the knowledge, the years of accumulated mastery. It was a faint spark, but a spark nonetheless. One afternoon, Eris brought a small, timid boy into the room. Leo, a wisp of a child, no older than 7, with eyes that seemed too large for his pale face, and hands that trembled slightly as he clutched a worn sketchbook. "Leo has a rare bone disease," Eris explained softly. "He loves drawing fantastical creatures. I thought, perhaps you two could inspire each other." Ethan bristled, ready to dismiss the whole saccharine charade. But then he saw Leo's drawings. Intricate, whimsical beasts with impossible wings and multiple eyes, all brought to life with a vibrancy that belied the boy's frail appearance. He saw a kindred spirit, a fellow creator, however small. Weeks bled into a new routine. Eris would bring in small bags of discarded metal scraps from the hospital's maintenance department, twisted wires, bits of old piping, worn-out hinges. Ethan, perched precariously on the edge of his bed, or sometimes, when his strength allowed, in a wheelchair, would begin to direct Leo. "See this piece, Leo. he'd murmur, pointing with a spindly finger. If we bend it just so, it could be the neck of your griffin. And this flattened washer, that's the perfect eye. Leo, with his small, unsteady hands, would try to manipulate the metal, sometimes with a child's clumsy frustration, sometimes with surprising dexterity. Ethan found himself explaining not just the technique. Hold the pliers firmer, like this, with your thumb pressed against the hinge, but the emotion behind the shapes. Imagine your creature. Is it fierce? Then the lines should be sharp, angular. Is it sad? Then maybe a curve, like a sigh. He spoke of the vulnerability in the twisted metal, the way a seemingly rigid material could be coaxed into expressing tenderness or defiance. It was less about teaching a child to sculpt, and more about teaching himself to see art not just as a projection of his own internal struggle, but as a language, a bridge. One afternoon, they were working on a particularly intricate dragon eel, a creature with serpentine coils and razor-sharp fins. Leo, attempting to fuse two pieces of wire with a tiny child-safe soldering iron Eris had provided, slipped. The soldering iron didn't burn him, but the sharp edge of a discarded metal shim sliced across his small thumb. A thin line of crimson bloomed on his pale skin. Leo let out a startled cry, his eyes welling up. Ethan, without thinking, without the usual filter of self-pity or artistic detachment, reacted instantly. His own hands, still aching with neuropathic pain, reached out, clumsy but urgent. "Oh, Leo, are you all right?" he rasped, his voice rough with concern. He fumbled for a tissue, pressing it clumsily against the cut, his eyes fixed on the small, bleeding thumb. The sudden, unbidden surge of empathy startled him. His own pain, a constant companion, receded for a moment, eclipsed by the boy's distress. "It stings," Leo whimpered, tears tracing paths down his cheeks. "I know, buddy. I know," Ethan said, his voice softening with a tenderness he hadn't known he possessed. He looked at the cut, then at his own scarred and calloused hands, marred by years of accidental burns and stray slices from grinding wheels. "You know, when I was first starting out, I once dropped a piece of sheet metal on my foot right through my boot. Had to get a dozen stitches. Look," and he extended his foot surprisingly, pulling back the sheet to reveal the pale, puckered scar on his instep. "It hurt like hell, but it healed. And now it's just a story, a reminder of how much goes into making something." Leo sniffled, looking from his thumb to Ethan's scarred foot, a flicker of fascination replacing the fear in his eyes. He stopped crying. The small act of sharing, of making himself vulnerable by revealing his own past pain, his own imperfection, had a profound effect. It wasn't about the grand concepts of art or the existential dread of his illness. It was about a cut thumb, a shared moment of discomfort, and the simple human gesture of comfort. In that moment, watching Leo gingerly touch his still bleeding thumb, Ethan felt a crack in the hardened shell he had built around himself. His art had always been about his internal struggle, a solitary act of carving his essence into metal. But here, with this fragile boy, he saw something else. He saw art as a bridge, a connection, a way to alleviate someone else's pain, even if just for a moment. His own suffering had been so all-consuming, but now in the act of giving comfort, of sharing a part of himself, a tiny glimmer of hope ignited. The purpose of his art, and perhaps his life, wasn't just to express himself, but to connect, to heal, to build, not just with metal, but with other souls. The shift was subtle, profound, and utterly unexpected. He felt a different kind of warmth radiating through him, not the feverish heat of his illness, but something akin to peace. He knew with a certainty that transcended the grim prognosis, that this was the first fragile step towards a different kind of healing. The sterile white walls of the ICU room pressed in on Ethan, blurring at the edges as his vision swam. The rhythmic hiss and whoosh of the ventilator, a sinister lullaby, filled his ears, punctuated by the frantic staccato of monitors beeping an urgent, terrifying rhythm. He was adrift, tethered to life by a tangle of tubes and wires, his body a battlefield, his mind a fractured landscape of pain and terrifying visions. The seizure had come without warning, a lightning bolt of agony that had arced through his brain, twisting his limbs into grotesque contortions, robbing him of breath and plunging him into a terrifying abyss. Clara had been there, her face a mask of terror, her hand clutching his, her voice a distant, desperate plea echoing from a chasm. He remembered the paramedics, their faces grave, the rush through the hospital corridors, the blinding overhead lights, and then this, the suffocating embrace of the ICU. Now, in a semi-conscious state, hovering precariously between wakefulness and oblivion, Ethan found himself trapped in a nightmarish hallucination. His past sculptures, the powerful, angular forms he had crafted with such fierce intention, rose around him, no longer inert metal but monstrous, consuming entities. The echoes of industry became a cacophony of grinding gears and clanging metal, each piece a manifestation of his ambition, his isolation, his self-absorption. They loomed, threatening to crush him, their sharp edges glinting with a predatory hunger. The towering sentinel, once a symbol of his unwavering artistic vision, now felt like a stone gargoyle poised to fall. The intricate labyrinth of twisted rebar, a representation of his internal struggles, transformed into a suffocating maze, its cold metal pressing in, stealing his air. He saw his own reflection in their polished surfaces, gaunt, terrified, consumed by the very art he had created. They were beautiful, terrifying monuments to his ego, and they were devouring him. A cold sweat plastered his hair to his forehead, even as his body shivered uncontrollably. He tried to cry out, to push them away, but his throat was constricted, his limbs unresponsive. The monitors shrieked, mirroring his internal terror. Then a flicker of something else, a splash of vibrant color, a gentle melodic hum that cut through the metallic screeching. The monstrous sculptures began to recede, their harsh outlines softening, their metallic sheen giving way to an iridescent glow. And from the dissipating darkness emerged Leo's fantastical creatures. Not as static sculptures, but as living, breathing beings, ethereal and luminous. The winged serpent of hope, with its iridescent scales and gentle knowing eyes, glided past, its feathery tail leaving a trail of shimmering light. The Dreamweaver, a delicate, multi-limbed being, spun shimmering threads of warmth and comfort, wrapping them around him. The Guardian of Whispers, a creature with large, compassionate ears, leaned in, its presence radiating a profound sense of understanding. They didn't threaten, they invited. They beckoned him to follow through a labyrinth, yes, but this one was no longer a cage of rebar. It was a swirling vortex of opalescent light, alive with soft, shifting colors. He felt a profound sense of choice, stark and undeniable. To succumb to the darkness of the consuming sculptures, to the despair and isolation that had defined his old life, or to embrace the lightness of connection, the empathy, the shared vulnerability that Leo's creatures embodied. The path of his past self was a descent into a cold, metallic grave, a final, despairing surrender. The path offered by the fantastical creatures was a climb, arduous but illuminated, towards something he hadn't fully understood until now. Not just survival, but true living. He remembered Leo's small, unsteady hand in his, the warmth of the boy's skin, the tremor in his own voice as he confessed his accident. He remembered the unguarded joy in Leo's eyes when a piece of scrap metal finally took the shape of a creature from his imagination. It was a connection, a bridge built not from steel, but from empathy, from a shared vulnerability that transcended the harsh realities of their respective illnesses. A deep, primal urge to breathe, to live, surged through him. He fought against the grip of the ventilator, a desperate, gasping struggle. He willed his body to respond, not for himself, not for his art, but for the fragile thread of connection he had found. He wanted to feel the sun on his face, to hear Leo's bright laughter, to see Clara's worried but loving eyes, to truly feel the human touch he had so long resisted. The choice was clear, almost blindingly so. He chose life. He chose connection. He chose empathy. He felt a jolt, a sudden, sharp pain, followed by a profound release. The monstrous sculptures shattered into a million glittering shards, dissolving into nothingness. The light of Leo's creatures intensified, bathing him in a warm, healing glow. He felt himself floating, not sinking, but rising. When Ethan slowly, painfully regained true consciousness, the terrifying hallucinations had vanished, replaced by the hushed efficiency of the ICU. He was still weak, still tethered to machines, but the sense of immediate, suffocating dread had lifted. His chest felt less constricted. His breathing, though assisted, seemed less of a struggle. The beeping monitors, though still present, pulsed with a steadier, less alarming rhythm. Clara was there, her face etched with exhaustion and worry, but her eyes, when they met his, held a glimmer of incredulous hope. Ilara, surprisingly calm, held his hand, her lips moving in a silent prayer. The doctors, their expressions a mixture of professional stoicism and genuine bewilderment, spoke in hushed tones about stabilization and unforeseen improvement. "It's remarkable, Ethan," Dr. Thorne, the oncologist, said, his voice low, almost awestruck. "The seizure was severe. We were preparing for the worst. But your vitals are stabilizing, and the new scans, we're still processing them, but there's an unprecedented regression of the brain lesion, and the lung and foot tumors also show significant reduction. It's a miracle, frankly. An unforeseen synergistic response to the treatment, perhaps?" Ethan couldn't speak, but he looked from Dr. Thorne to Clara, then to Ilara, and finally, closing his eyes, saw the luminous, fantastical creatures guiding him through the labyrinth of light. He knew it wasn't just synergy. He knew it was more. He had chosen, and in that choice, something within him and within the universe had shifted. The crucible had been fired, and he, the metal, had been reshaped. The true test, however, lay in how he would now live this second chance. Now in a semi-conscious state, hovering precariously between oblivion and a torturous half-awareness, Ethan's mind became a canvas for terrifying, vivid hallucinations. The air, thick with the antiseptic tang of the hospital, shimmered, and the familiar forms of his past sculptures began to writhe and contort. The sleek, powerful Titan's embrace, once a testament to control and strength, now pulsed with a monstrous, consuming hunger, its sharp angles morphing into grasping claws that reached for him. Industrial Symphony, usually a harmonious interplay of salvaged gears and pipes, became a cacophony of grinding metal, its gears gnashing, threatening to pull him into its crushing maw. They weren't just sculptures. They were extensions of his old self, his self-imposed isolation, his art as a fortress against the world, now turning on him, devouring him from within. The cold, unyielding metal that had once been his comfort now felt like a cage, shrinking, suffocating. He saw himself, trapped within these gargantuan, self-made monuments, the air thinning, the light fading. This was the consequence of his artistic purity, his belief that true creation arose from solitary struggle. It was consuming him. Just as the darkness threatened to swallow him whole, a shimmering, ethereal light began to pierce through the metallic gloom. From the periphery of his vision, forms began to coalesce, gentle and undulating, unlike anything he had ever sculpted. They were Leo's creatures, fantastical and whimsical, but imbued with a surprising strength and a profound sense of peace. The multi-limbed, iridescent leviathan, the winged fox with its glowing eyes, the benevolent giant made of swirling stardust. They danced around him, their forms radiating a soft, golden warmth. They didn't consume, they guided. Each creature, born from Leo's innocent imagination and Ethan's grudging yet burgeoning empathy, felt like a beacon, illuminating a path through the labyrinth of despair. He saw the vulnerability in their twisted forms, the inherent beauty in their imperfections, the connection they forged between two disparate souls. A profound sense of choice settled over him, heavy and undeniable. He could feel the pull of the darkness, the seductive release of letting go, of succumbing to the consuming void his old art represented. It would be easy, but then he saw Leo's face, etched in his mind, full of trust and quiet wonder, and he felt the delicate weight of the small, scarred hand in his own, guiding the torch, sharing the struggle, finding joy in shared creation. He saw Clara's frantic, tear-streaked face, and Alara, her usually dramatic pronouncements replaced by silent, desperate pleas. He felt the warmth of Eris's quiet presence, the steady, knowing gaze that had seen beyond his hardened shell. This wasn't just about his life anymore. It was about connection, about the ripple effect of his existence. His art, once a solitary pursuit, had become a bridge. He didn't want to be consumed. He wanted to connect. He wanted to sculpt not just from his internal struggle, but from the boundless wellspring of shared humanity. With a surge of desperate will, he reached out, not for the cold, hard metal of his past, but for the shimmering, intangible light of connection. He fought against the overwhelming lethargy, the suffocating darkness, pushing, straining, willing himself back to the world of the living, back to Leo, back to the light. When Ethan finally emerged from the fog of his near-death experience, it was not with a dramatic jolt, but a slow, gradual awakening. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator was gone, replaced by the soft, steady rhythm of his own breath. The blinding lights were dimmed, and the frantic beeping of monitors had softened into a gentle, reassuring hum. His first conscious sensation was the gentle pressure of Clara's hand, warm and calloused, holding his. Her face, though still etched with exhaustion, was alight with a cautious hope. He could hear Alara's soft murmuring from a nearby chair, a prayer, not a pronouncement. Days folded into weeks, each one bringing a tiny, almost imperceptible improvement. The medical team, a rotating cast of serious-faced doctors and nurses, spoke in hushed, amazed tones. Subsequent scans, performed with an almost reverent disbelief, revealed what they could only describe as a miracle. The massive brain metastasis, which had caused the seizure and threatened to end his life, had not just stopped growing, it had regressed significantly, a shadow of its former terrifying size. The aggressive lung tumors showed remarkable shrinkage, and the new tumor on his foot, the one that had solidified his despair, was undeniably smaller, less inflamed. "Mr. Hayes," Dr. Anya Sharma, his oncologist, said, her voice a blend of professional detachment and genuine awe, during one of his first fully coherent conversations. We are seeing an unforeseen synergistic response to your current treatment regimen. The speed and extent of this regression, particularly the brain lesion, it's truly unprecedented in our experience with ALM of this stage. Your body has responded in a way we simply cannot fully explain. She paused, her gaze searching his, as if looking for an answer he couldn't articulate. "It's remarkable." Ethan just nodded, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips. He knew. He knew it wasn't just a synergistic response. It was the crucible's fire, yes, the relentless assault of illness and treatment, but it was also the profound, agonizing choice he had made in that liminal space between life and death. He had chosen connection over consumption, vulnerability over isolation, empathy over ego. That choice, more than any drug or radiation beam, had reshaped his soul, and in turn his body had mirrored that transformation. His tremors, once a constant, debilitating tremble, had subsided to an almost imperceptible tremor, particularly when he focused. He could hold a pen steady again, trace lines on paper without them veering wildly. The pain in his hands, though still present, was duller, more manageable. He slowly regained his strength, first shuffling down the hospital corridors, then taking tentative steps, feeling the ground beneath his feet, a renewed appreciation for simply being. His first act upon being discharged after a tearful and deeply emotional reunion with Leo, who presented him with a crayon drawing of a fantastical creature that looked suspiciously like a healthy, strong Ethan, was to return to his studio. The space, once a sanctuary of isolation, now felt different. It still held echoes of his past, the scent of metal dust and oil, the raw power of his tools. But something had shifted. He looked at his old sculptures, the powerful, imposing forms that had once been his pride, and saw them with new eyes. They were magnificent, yes, but they were also lonely. He didn't touch them. Instead, he went to a corner of the studio he had previously ignored, a pile of discarded metal scraps, odd bits of wire, and even some pieces of driftwood and smooth, river-worn stones Clara had collected for him during his illness. His hands, still a little unsteady, reached for a piece of rusted copper tubing, then a delicate length of twisted steel cable, and finally a small smooth pebble. He began to work, not with the aggressive heat and thunderous clang of his old welding, but with a quiet, almost reverent touch. He filed, he bent, he joined with a gentler flame, integrating the reclaimed metal with the softer, organic forms. The piece that emerged, slowly, painstakingly, was unlike anything he had ever created. It was a delicate, intricate sculpture inspired by one of Leo's fantastical creature designs. A small, benevolent guardian, its body formed from the copper tubing, its wings from the twisted cable, and its heart, a luminous focal point, the smooth river stone. It was vulnerable, yet strong, interconnected. It pulsed with a quiet, undeniable life, symbolizing not just his own journey, but the profound truth that true creation, true strength, came not from isolation, but from connection, from vulnerability shared, and from the boundless grace of a second chance. He saw himself, a tiny, helpless figure, trapped within the monstrous metal forms, being crushed by the very creations he had poured his life into. The pain was excruciating, not just physical, but a soul-deep agony as his artistic identity, his very being, was devoured by his own hubris. Then the crushing darkness began to fracture, pierced by iridescent light. The grinding cacophony of his metallic nightmares receded, replaced by a gentle, ethereal hum. Through the swirling chaos, familiar, whimsical shapes began to emerge. Not the cold, unforgiving angles of his own making, but the fluid, imaginative forms of Leo's fantastical creatures. A whimsical dragon with shimmering scales, its eyes glowing with playful curiosity, nudged him gently, its metallic wings, impossibly light and airy, fanning away the encroaching despair. A multi-limbed creature, like a benevolent spider, extended a delicate, welcoming appendage, its surface smooth and warm. He felt a profound sense of choice, a fork in the labyrinth of his semi-conscious mind. To succumb to the monstrous echoes of his past, the isolating forms that had defined him, or to reach for the lightness, the interconnectedness, the pure, unburdened joy of creation he had glimpsed through Leo. The choice wasn't just about survival, it was about the very essence of his soul. Was his art a shield to keep the world out, or a bridge to connect with it? Was his life to be a testament to solitary struggle, or a symphony of shared vulnerability? With a monumental, almost imperceptible effort, Ethan reached out, not with his physical hand, but with the deepest part of his being, towards the light, towards Leo's creations. He felt a jolt, not of pain, but of pure, unadulterated energy, coursing through him. The monstrous sculptures shattered into a million glittering shards, dissolving into nothingness. The whimsical creatures solidified, their forms now familiar, comforting, pulling him forward. He felt a profound sense of release, as if a lifetime of self-imposed burdens had been lifted. The ventilator's rhythm, once a torment, became a gentle, rhythmic breath of life. Days later, the sterile hum of the ICU began to soften, the sharp edges of his reality slowly returning. Clara's face, etched with exhaustion, but now alight with a cautious hope, was the first concrete sign of his return. Ilara, her eyes red-rimmed but shining, clutched his hand, whispering fervent prayers of thanks. He was still weak, his body still recovering from the brutal assault, but the constant gnawing pain had receded to a dull ache. The tremors that had plagued his dominant hand were gone, replaced by a faint, almost imperceptible tremor of returning strength. Dr. Anya Sharma, his oncologist, stood beside his bed, a look of profound bewilderment on her face. "Ethan," she began, her voice a mixture of awe and professional disbelief. "Your latest scans, they're unprecedented. The brain metastasis, the one that caused the seizure, has regressed almost entirely. The lung and foot tumors, significant reduction. We've never seen such a rapid, comprehensive response to treatment in a case as aggressive as yours." She shuffled through a stack of papers, her brow furrowed. We're attributing it to an unforeseen synergistic response to the immunotherapy, a highly unusual confluence of factors. Ethan met her gaze, a faint knowing smile playing on his lips. He knew it was more. He knew it was the choice he had made in the labyrinth of his pain, the embrace of a connection he had once scorned. The physical miracle was merely the outward manifestation of an internal, spiritual reshaping. He had faced the abyss and chosen light, chosen connection, chosen vulnerability. He had faced his own self-imposed artistic purity and found it wanting. His first act upon his partial return to the studio, still in a wheelchair, was not to grab his welding torch and forge a statement of defiant strength. Instead, he asked Clara to bring him a box of discarded metal scraps, the very pieces he had once deemed unworthy. His hands, still a little unsteady, sifted through them, no longer seeing refuse but potential. He picked up a twisted piece of copper wire, a bent aluminum strip, a small rusted gear. With a newfound gentleness, he began to manipulate them, not into the powerful, imposing forms of his past, but into something delicate, intricate, almost ethereal. He created a small, shimmering creature, its body woven from fine copper wire, its wings fashioned from iridescent titanium fragments, its eyes, two tiny polished ball bearings, gleaming with a quiet wisdom. It was an homage to Leo's fantastical creatures, but infused with his own reclaimed metal, a testament to resilience, vulnerability, and the profound beauty found not in isolated strength, but in interconnectedness. It was the first sculpture of his new life, a tangible echo of the empathy that had reshaped his soul. He called it Whispers of Renewal. The canvas of his life had been scarred, but now it was painted with a new, vibrant hue. The pain had been real, the fear profound, but through it all, Ethan had found something more precious than any artistic triumph. The true source of creation, not just from within, but through the profound, vulnerable connection to others. He had been given a second chance, and he knew with every fiber of his being that it was not just for him, but for what he could now give.